morning, ladies and gentlemen. In part 10 of our course on British art, we move into the 19th century. The title of today's presentation that you can find on Moodle is Regency and Industrial Britain, and this is precisely that, Regency and Industrial Britain. Especially the way that the Industrial Revolution was perceived in the 19th century and later in the Victorian period. So the first two slides in your presentation are, as usual, the reinterpretation of the period that we are going to discuss by later artists, and especially the Regency period. So the first 10, sometimes 20 years of the 19th century are remembered as the time of elegance, as the time of beautiful fashion with high waistlines, as the time of flirtation and happy childhood, and this is what you can see in the two later works by Victorian artists, even late Victorian artists. One by John Petty called Two Strings to Her Bow. This is a kind of joke. This is humorous work showing a pretty young Regency woman being courted by two young gentlemen. So she is undecided, but she likes to flirt with both. They are in the countryside, they are walking in the field together, all three of them. So of course the lady is very happy and pleased with herself, the gentleman less so, but that's the life. The other one is by a quite famous book illustrator from the late 19th century called Kate Greenaway. She mostly illustrated books for children. And this one illustration that you have in your presentation called Mayday shows a cheerful procession of children and young women with some flowers, possibly to celebrate the coming of the month of May, so a traditional folk occasion that was still practiced in some places in England. The clothes suggest the Regency period, and everything is cheerful and happy. The weather is beautiful, and the people are happy. This is how the Regency was remembered, and this is one side of it. If you look at it, if you look at the life of the rich, if you look at the life of the Prince Regent himself, so the Prince of Wales, who after his father George III lost his sanity, was asked by the Parliament, was given the additional function of the regent. It means acting in place of the incapacitated king. He did that in the 10 or 11 years before his accession in 1820. But before that, as the Prince of Wales, he already gained some notoriety as a party animal, as a lover of food, drink and women. And the place that epitomizes this side of the Regency is the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. This was commissioned by the Prince of Wales and built by his favorite architect John Nash. And if you ever go to Brighton, you'll see that from the outside it looks as something from the Muslim world, as Taj Mahal perhaps, as something from the Orient. And from the inside it's actually more Chinese, with a lot of red and gold and flying dragons and very elaborately decorated interiors. I strongly recommend that you see the website of the Royal Pavilion. And this is something that you can Google. There are little films that show the building and its interiors. This was precisely the holiday home of the future King George IV. This was the place where he invited his guests, where he threw lavish parties. Even the kitchen was a place where he invited his guests to see the best French chefs at work. After the French Revolution, many great French chefs were looking for employment. Of course, the French aristocracy was mostly decimated by the revolution. So many of them moved to England, working for the aristocratic houses, and of course the best of them worked for the royal family, including the greatest patron of the culinary arts, namely the Prince Regent. So we have the continuation of the 18th century tradition of great portraiture. So we have beautiful people, beautifully dressed women portrayed by the likes of Thomas Lawrence. Here you have an example showing Margaret, Countess of Blessington. So this is one side of the Regency period. If you were rich, especially if you were the friend of the Prince Regent, you were really able to have the time of your life, probably at the public's expense, because the prince was quite notorious for spending the public money on his own private pleasures. But there was the second aspect, a darker aspect of the Regency, and this is something that many art historians believe to be the original contribution of Great Britain into the world of arts, namely the political caricature. You might say that the caricaturists of the Regency period followed in the footsteps of William Hogarth. To some extent they were. William Hogarth was more of a moralizer than a satirist, but his works, especially his cycles, have quite a lot of elements of social satire, or even to some extent political satire. So in the early 19th century, with the growing interest in the press, in the printed word, you have a lot of public interest in the criticism of whatever was bad with the society, especially the upper classes and the rich and the fashionable society. And what was wrong with the politics, especially, of course, the royal family. The old mad king and the young princess who were spendthrifts, who were womanizers, who were very unpopular with the public. So I will give you the link to a very interesting BBC documentary called Rude Britannia, not Rule Britannia, but Rude Britannia. It's a 3-part documentary. The first part talks about the period from Hogarth to the Regency, and much is spoken about the beginning of the political caricature, and especially the 3 names that you would like to remember. Basically 2 names. James Gilray and Thomas Rowlandson, slightly later, joined by the 3rd man who will eclipse them both and really have a long life and a very fruitful career, George Cruikshank. So James Gilray was, as you can find in the documentary, a rather caustic and bitter man, and he showed no compassion for the subjects that he caricatured. There is a very famous drawing and engraving later made by Gilray showing the Prince Regent, or the Prince of Wales, as a disgusting glutton, as a man who feasts at a table surrounded by food and drink and drugs and all kinds of paraphernalia that allude to his lewd and immoral life. There are some medicine bottles that suggest that he might be infected with a venereal disease. There is a chamber pot overflowing with urine or perhaps vomit. So this man is just plainly disgusting. And if you Google James Gilray, this is what he does. He would spare nobody. He wouldn't spare the king. He produced a lot of very, very dark and bitter images of the French during the Revolution and Terror, actually cannibals murdering and eating people and behaving in a completely bestial way. So here we have James Gilray. The other one of the early political commentators and caricaturists was Thomas Rowlandson. And here in the presentation you have his print making fun of the Duchess of Devonshire. You may remember this splendid, beautiful socialite who was portrayed by Gainsborough. You may remember her from the film with Keira Knightley. She was also quite engaged in the political life, and here we have her trying to convince some people to vote for the party that she supported by selling kisses. So this is this famous aristocrat behaving in a rather flirty, if not completely lewd manner. And this is quite typical for Rowlandson. If you watch the documentary, you will see that he appears to be quite compassionate to his subjects, although he makes fun of them. He liked the pleasures of life, he liked drinking, he liked partying, he liked the pleasures of sex, and many of his caricatures are, I would say, verging on pornography, although they are usually quite playful in their tone. There are examples in the documentary if you're interested, or you can just Google Thomas Rowlandson, and you'll see that very often there is nudity, there is sexual innuendo, or even more, I would say, obscene pictures. So these men produced their work regularly, commenting on everything that was happening. These images were printed and displayed in the windows of print shops, and people every day would just go up into the window of the print shop and see for themselves, like the Chronicle, like the newspaper, about everything that was happening in the high society, in the political world, in the country basically. And very soon a young artist joined them, George Cruikshank. His career starts in the Regency period. He would caricature the dandies for their ridiculous fashion, so the fashionable young people from the rich sections of the society. He would caricature the royal family quite mercilessly, perhaps not as mercilessly as Gilray, but he doesn't really show them a lot of compassion. He was actually he was the man who once made a print of the Prince of Wales as an actual whale, an animal, because he was so ridiculous and so fat, and so he was like, the whale. And that's the beginning of this media culture, image culture that continues until this day. This is the beginning of the great influence of illustration. George Cruikshank would live to be 85, and he is now mostly remembered as a book illustrator. He had a very successful collaboration with Charles Dickens. So if you recall the original illustrations, for example, for Oliver Twist, this is the work of George Cruikshank, and we will return to his later Victorian work at the end of today's class. But now let's move to the industrial subjects. So as you hopefully know, the Industrial Revolution started around the middle of the 18th century, but by the time of the Regency it was very visible. It influenced basically daily lives of people, and in the Victorian period, so after the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837, after the death of George IV and his younger brother William IV, because George left no surviving heir, the same happened to William. Victoria came to the throne, and during her reign, the industry and the industrial themes basically dominated the lives of the people. The industrialization, the urbanization, the new lifestyle connected with the cities, the new economy which transformed the agricultural country that Britain was before into the first modern industrial country in the world. This is the process that lasts several decades and only accelerates in time, possibly continuing until today. So we have already encountered some artists, especially Turner, who were at least partially fascinated with the industry, with the modernity, with the new technologies replacing the old, sometimes more beautiful, like you remember the Fighting Temeraire, so the new steamship replacing the old sailing ships. But he was fascinated with modernity, at least to some extent. If you look at his images of the industrial towns with the bustling commercial life in the foreground and the old castle in the background. If you look at the Steam, Rain and Speed, showing this very powerful image of the modern technology, the train crossing the bridge. Of course, Turner was not the only one, and he was not the first. And you may remember Joseph Wright of Derby, the 18th century painter, who was fascinated with science, who was fascinated with nighttime scenes and artificial light and interesting lighting conditions. So if you look at some of his works, they actually also show the growing interest in the technology, in the industry. There are images showing the inside of an iron forge from the outside or from the inside. So we have a nighttime scene and the interior of the forge, which is lighted by the fire and by the hot iron which is being processed. If you look at the people, at the workers, they are shown with some nobility. They are not poor, they are not the monstrous, inhuman figures. They are shown as classical sculptures. They are really shown as beautiful, strong, powerful people in control of what they're doing, and the future is theirs. This is the moment when we have new types of buildings in Britain, like the Iron Bridge in Shropshire, the first ever bridge made of iron rather than wood or stone. And it was so popular, it was so fascinating. It was made in the 1770s that tourists will come to Shropshire, to the Iron Bridge Gorge, just to see this place, just to see the bridge. And artists would also go. So here we have a photograph of the Iron Bridge and late 18th century painting showing the Iron Bridge, because people would be interested to see such modern buildings. A similar thing would happen to the industrial buildings, like the mills. The word mill, of course, doesn't have to mean the flour mill, the grain mill, like the mill that the family of John Constable had, but it could be the textile mill, so the factory producing textiles of wool or more often cotton. So in the 18th century, we have such mills, mostly in Derbyshire, also in Lancashire. And if you look at the photographs, many of these places are now UNESCO sites, so they have been appreciated as historical monuments. And they look as almost as something that comes from the 20th century. They look completely modern. This is architecture devoid of any decorative elements. This is just pure pragmatism. It looks like blocks of flats. It looks like modern factories, or the factories from the 20th century. So we have Cromford Mill in Derbyshire, built in the 18th century. We have many industrial buildings in Manchester, possibly the city that really epitomized this period of industrial revolution is Manchester. We have the warehouses, we have the mills and other industrial buildings. We have the canals through which the works of industry were sent to ports and later to other places outside Britain. So this is the beginning of the modern industrial world. And at the end of this part, you have some paintings. So we have Philip Jacques de Lutherberg, so Mr. Leatherbags, if you watched A Picture of Britain. So the romantic painter who was interested in the romantic landscape, so the sublime and the picturesque. So he would take the inspiration for the sublime, so the kind of awe-inspiring, dramatic in nature, not only from the natural world like the mountains and the waterfalls or the historical ruins. He would also be inspired by the modern technology. So we have Colebrook Dale at night, so one of the places in Shropshire where the Industrial Revolution was really at full swing. We also have another painting from this period by Paul Sunbeam Mann with Bedlam furnace, one of the furnaces processing metal. So they look like the illustration to one of the poems by Blake, in which he talks about the dark satanic mills. They really look dark with the smoke, with the soot, with the coal, and they really look satanic with those hellfires being visible, especially in nighttime scene. There is this beautiful scene by the Lutherberg showing the furnace at night. So it really looks like I don't know, a scene of war or a scene of volcanic eruption, or perhaps the scene of hell and the end of the world. And if we compare it with a slightly later artist, John Martin, and especially his very famous and very large scale painting called The Great Day of His Wrath, which of course alludes to the biblical theme and the end of the world and the kind of Armageddon being the divine punishment for the sinful world. If you find this painting, John Martin's The Great Day of His Wrath, from the middle of the 19th century, you will see very similar images of the fire, of the storm, of the earth trembling and kind of falling in on itself. If you find a good quality copy and you look at it in close-up, you will see the buildings crumbling, and you will even see a train rushing into some sort of precipice. So it's the modern world that's being destroyed by this supernatural Armageddon. So modernity could at the same time be inspiring and interesting and modern. And of course, in the 19th century, whatever was modern was fashionable immediately, and people would go and see it and want the souvenirs and everything. But at the same time, it's dangerous and scary, even at this sort of biblical scale. So let's now look at some examples of Victorian art showing those themes of industrialization and urbanization and the industrial modernity.